All set. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Dick Morningstar, Chairman of the Global Energy Center here at the Atlantic Council. And on behalf of the Global Energy Center and our South Asia Center, I'm pleased to welcome you all here today for what should be a great discussion on the current status of U.S. and international sanctions on the Iranian economy, including the Iranian energy sector. The fact that we have such a good crowd, it really does indicate the importance of this subject. And there's no doubt that the implementation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action has materially impacted the Iranian economy. But the question is how much? And we just hear so many conflicting questions and comments about what the real situation is that I hope today that we'll begin to get some clarification. And for business leaders and policymakers alike, it's critical to understand the investment and political climate. And again, I know that the experts that we have today will help to develop a collective understanding of these issues. So let me introduce the panel and our moderator. We have who I would call, at least at one time, the Sanctions twins at the State Department, because when I was there, they were the two people who were so actively involved. We have Chris Backemeyer, who now is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Iranian Affairs in the State Department's Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs. And prior to that, Chris was the Deputy Coordinator for Sanctions Policy and the lead sanctions negotiator for the United States in the P5+1 negotiations with Iran. David Mortlock is now a valued non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center. He's a partner at the law firm of Wilkie, Farr & Gallagher, where he focuses on sanctions, export controls, and other international trade issues. And he previously served in a number of roles involving sanctions policy in the White House and the State Department. He was in the legal advisor's office at the State Department, right, where he worked closely with Chris on a number of these issues. And we also have a person who I'm sure most of you know if you've been to events here, Barbara Slavin, who's the acting director of the Future of Iran initiative at the Atlantic Council and is the Washington correspondent for almonitor.com, which is a website devoted to news from and about the Middle East. And Barbara really has been the driving force behind the Council's Iran work, and we're lucky to have her with us today. And also moderating the event today is one of our old friends. Well, she's not old, but she's an old friend. And we're extremely excited to again have Yagana Torbati, a defense and sanctions policy reporter for Reuters. Yagana brings deep expertise on Iran to today's discussion and has covered the politics, economy, foreign policy, and nuclear program for Reuters from 2011 to 2013, yeah. And so again, we're pleased together to have such a great group of experts and to have such a really impressive turnout. Just one final housekeeping note. I would encourage you all to join the conversation on Twitter at AC Energy and using hashtag AC Energy. And with that, to Yagana. Thank you.
All right, is this working? Yes. So thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you, Ambassador Morningstar, for the introduction. And thank you to the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center and the South Asia Center for hosting us today for this panel. Most Western sanctions on Iran were lifted about 8 months ago, as simultaneous with the official implementation of the nuclear deal, Iran has gained access to tens of billions of dollars of its frozen assets abroad. It has signed dozens of agreements with international businesses worth tens of billions of dollars for airplanes, factories, plants, and other industry and infrastructure. Their oil exports are now close to pre-sanction levels of around 2.5 million barrels per day. European airlines are resuming their direct flights to Iran, and the World Bank estimates that Iran's economy will grow by over 4% in 2016, which is in sharp contrast to its trajectory before the nuclear deal. But yet, not a single major European bank has established meaningful links with Iran's financial sector, which means that those billions of dollars in deals can't actually go through yet. Non-US firms say that they find it very difficult to navigate the US sanctions that do remain on Iran. The Iranian supreme leader has said that the nuclear agreement was an experience that showed the futility of negotiating with the United States. And it seems like every month brings us news of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps arresting another Iranian dual national, which, in addition to the impact on those individuals and their families, certainly makes operating in Iran a special risk for international businesses. So as we approach the one-year mark of the nuclear deal's implementation and the lifting of sanctions, how should we think about the state of affairs that I just outlined? Are these the expected hiccups that go along with implementing an extraordinarily complex and intricate multilateral agreement, or are they the harbinger of more fundamental problems that may scuttle the deal down the road? I won't repeat our guests' bios, as Ambassador Morningstar already went through those for you, but I do want to note that this is Chris's first public on-the-record event as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Iran, so we're very glad to have him here. David is certainly someone that I call when I want to get smart on sanctions, so we're also happy to have him here. And Barbara is a frequent traveler to Iran and has written a great deal on Iran, so she will offer some special insights into the workings of that country. So, Chris, I'd like to start with you. Can you lay out for us right now how you view the overall relationship between Iran and the United States, taking into account both the nuclear deal specifically, but then also in their broader arenas of tension?
Sure, I'm happy to. I think you really laid it out well, and the questions that you posed at the end are these, expected hiccups for a multilateral deal, or are they the harbinger of bad things to come? I think it's the former. It's easy, I think, to have gotten wrapped up as we got through the JCPOA and have an expectation that, the JCPOA was going to solve all of our problems. It is going to solve all of Iran's problems, both economically and globally. It certainly wasn't our expectation, those of us that negotiated the deal, that was going to be the case. We knew that the nuclear deal was robust, that it addressed a critical threat to the United States. We knew that it resulted in pretty significant sanctions relief that applied to, largely to non-U.S. countries or non-U.S. companies. And it was a major step forward in our relationship. It was a major step towards solving those problems. And we got a lot of criticism at the time, allegations that, you can't trust the Iranians, and they still are doing all these other bad things. And we acknowledged that. We said, this isn't intended to solve all of our other problems. This isn't intended to solve Iran's support for terrorism. This isn't intended to solve their abuses of human rights. And as it turns out, it has not solved those particular issues. That was not our intent. The way we look at it is, every single one of those things would have been much, much worse had Iran had a nuclear weapon, regardless of human rights or terrorism or an advancing ballistic missile program, harassment of U.S. citizens in Iran. All those things would be much worse if Iran was equipped with that. So we still feel that the JCPOA did exactly what it was supposed to do. It got Iran, it took Iran's breakout timeline from 30 days, or from less than 90 days to over a year. It took its enriched uranium stockpile from down by 98%. And it implemented transparency measures that were really unprecedented in this non-proliferation context. So, in what we've seen on the nuclear side, so far, Iran has lived up to its commitments, and that's a good thing. On our side, the U.S. has lived up to its commitments as well. We have lifted all the sanctions that we said we would. It's as you read the press, it can often get a little bit confusing, because there's sometimes allegations that we promised Iran a certain GDP growth rate, or we promised Iran a certain number of banks. The United States, nor any country, has the ability to promise a certain amount of economic relief to another country. That's obviously just not something that is possible. We promised to relieve a certain amount of, or a discrete number of sanctions, and we did that. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you, though, that means our job is done. We realize that the health of the deal revolves on all parties, all of the P5+1, being satisfied with it. And so we've spent a great deal of time trying to make sure that both the Iranians and our European partners, and those that weren't partners in the P5+1 but that are on the global stage, know that the United States is not standing in the way of business opportunities and is not intending to use our existing sanctions to try to duplicate any of those that were in place in the JCPOA. Now, you made some really good points about the progress we've seen so far. It's worth pointing those things out. Iran's oil sales are up over 2 million barrels a day. You never would have thought that would have happened just a year ago. That's pretty impressive. Oil revenues were something like $2.85 billion, I think, in May, compared to $1.1 billion last year on average. Those are some pretty big things. According to Iran's own statements, they have over 400 correspondent accounts set up with international banks in both Europe and Asia. And so it's worth putting into context when the IMF is projecting 4% growth, something we'd really like in this country, and that's not too bad. So 4% growth is pretty good. And so when you look at those things all in that context, you look at Iran complying with its commitments on the nuclear side, I feel very comfortable saying that the JCPOA is working as we intended it to. Now, on the broader relationship, which is a very good segue, you're right. We continue to have major concerns with things that Iran does outside the sphere of the nuclear program. Iran's support for the Assad regime in Syria, in particular. It's a support for the Houthis in Yemen. Its continued support for terrorism in the region, including militant terrorist groups like Hezbollah. These are things that we continue to counter. That's exactly why we have these other sanctions in place that we didn't relieve as part of the nuclear deal. That's exactly why we weren't comfortable relieving them at the time. And so we have a lot of work to do before we ever solve all those problems. And they're very big items on the agenda. For now, though, we feel very comfortable in what we have accomplished on the JCPOA context. And then just lastly, and I'll be quiet. You mentioned the Supreme Leader's comments. It's not for me to comment on everything he says, but I can tell you that over the course of our negotiations, from the very beginning, the Supreme Leader's made a variety of comments, often negative about the negotiations. At the end of the day, we're continuing to go down the track that we've laid out, which is implementing the JCPOA and continuing to counter the other behaviors that we don't like in Iran. And we'll just have to see how the politics plays out there. Turns out we have a pretty vigorous political debate in our own country as well. And a lot of times we have to let that all happen while we're trying to achieve our own policy goals kind of underneath the surface.
And just to kind of follow up on that, I recognize there's a kind of a mirrored debate on both sides, but you don't have in the United States the head of state, casting doubt on the nuclear deal, saying that Iran was unfair or is not living up to its commitments. You do have that situation in Iran. Can you talk maybe a little bit more in depth about what's the reaction within the State Department, within your team, when you hear the Supreme Leader saying these things? Does it make you want to do more to alleviate the pressure on Iran, to encourage businesses to go back? Do you all sort of, just ignore it? What's the reaction?
Well, certainly it's not a situation where they make a comment like that and we feel like we have to do more than we did in the JCPOA. I mean, we agreed to a certain context. What we're committed to doing is making sure that what we did in the JCPOA is real, is understood by the international community, that those things are implemented the way everyone expected them to, and we put a lot of effort into doing that, sending teams all over the world to explain these things to companies. We do a lot of engagement both here in Washington and the United States, as well as overseas. And so that's an ongoing effort, and I think we would be doing that regardless of what senior officials in Iran would say. Comparing, that situation to our president, look, we've got very different political systems. We have a democracy. We have a Congress that is finely tuned to everything that we say on this, and so we do not try to use international statements to try to accomplish, things beyond what we've already done in writing. And so I just don't know that those are the two right people to compare.
Okay, sure. And you mentioned some of the outreach the U.S. government has done. I just want to cite some figures. This is according to Treasury acting under Secretary Adam Zubin. who said that in 2015, OFAC, which is the office that implements sanctions, which we'll very much get into, fielded over 85,000 calls on its hotline from banks, legal counsel, and individuals with sanctions questions, and they do this all with a staff of fewer than 200 people. So one of those legal counsel members who probably calls OFAC quite a bit is David. So I'd like to turn to you, David. Can you start off by giving us kind of a broad overview of where we actually do stand with the return of international business to Iran? There was a lot of excitement in the run-up to the nuclear deal and in the initial months afterward. What are some of the obstacles that the private sector has had?
Sure, absolutely. Well, I think first of all, in a broad sense, there's no question that the implementation of the deal has been successful in opening new business opportunities in Iran. I think the clearest numbers that Chris cited with respect to oil exports are just the beginning. We're seeing a lot of activity in the energy sector. You can see it, in fact, through the insurance industry as a great window because you're seeing insurance exposure for shipping to and from Iran. You're seeing exposure for activities in the energy sector, in the oil and gas services. You're also seeing a lot of exporters looking to Iran. Iran is obviously a very attractive market. It's sort of consumer focused, and there's in terms of compliance, exporting goods is one of the most relatively simple areas you can get into. We're even seeing the beginning of looking at equity investments. There's obviously a long way to go on that, but actual foreign direct investment in Iran is under discussion, and specific projects are being looked at by companies. Nonetheless, I mean, there's obviously still significant challenges, right? Iran is not Europe. And I think first and foremost, obviously in my day-to-day, is seeing the challenges from sanctions. Now, those challenges, though, with respect to sanctions, I would say they're challenges, but they're not obstacles, right? The sanctions regime that the JCPOA laid out, that OFAC is implementing, is manageable. It is manageable, and I think we are seeing companies take on responsibility for making sure that they are in compliance with U.S. sanctions, whether it's non-U.S. companies, whether it's U.S. parents of non-U.S. companies, whether it's U.S. companies that are simply worried about their goods or services ending up in Iran because of others doing business there. I think we're seeing companies tackle those challenges and nonetheless think about entering and actually entering the Iranian market. There's no question that some of those issues can get difficult. The role of U.S. persons, obviously, is still something that companies need to address. Screening for SDNs in Iran and ensuring that you're not engaged with individuals and entities on the SDN list or the European sanctions list is it's manageable. It's something that companies simply need to set up a process and a set of procedures to do to ensure that they're not crossing any lines and getting into trouble on the back end. I think one other challenge is the reputational risk. There's still some concern about criticism from Congress, from certain members of Congress, from NGOs that still have concerns about the nuclear deal. But I think, as the election, depending on the outcome, may give people more confidence that the deal is here to stay. And then finally, I think the other significant challenge is Iran itself, right? Is the fact that Iranians as business partners, the Iranian government as a business partner, has some unique challenges. Is not the most transparent entity in the world. Is not great at providing information about the entities involved in any particular transaction, is not great about helping with due diligence and making that process easier on companies that are looking at the Iranian market. And I think if they were to do so, I think they give a lot of comfort to companies, not just looking at exporting goods or services, but looking at the next level equity investment, and financial services, which is really where we're still seeing the hesitation and the reluctance from even non-U.S. companies. I think, from my perch outside the government, I can now do the very easy thing of saying what the government should do, and of course, Chris can just snap his fingers and make that happen. But I think as Undersecretary Zubin said yesterday, I think OFAC is engaging, but there's a lot more that could be done. More explicit FAQs that kind of go beyond the basics and the most obvious elements of the FAQs. In releasing enforcement actions, being much more explicit about why OFAC took that approach and why why the legal theory behind why the entity involved was actually found to be in violation of sanctions. There's no lawyers engaged in sanctions compliance tend not to be on Westlaw, looking at decades and decades of cases and decisions. They tend to be going by very recent interpretations by OFAC, by rules of practice, by reading the tea leaves of what OFAC has done most recently. And with the JCPOA, there is only 8 months of tea leaves out there. So that can make it challenging. So I think not just engagement, but actual public written comments. If you've got the phone number and can call someone up at OFAC, it's true. They will get back to you. They will be helpful. But that assumes you have the phone number, and not everybody does. And then from the private sector also, I think the reality is, there are a lot of complaints from the private sector that it's too hard, it's too difficult. I'm sure Chris hears this quite often. But the reality is, companies, if they scratch the surface, I think they'd realize that there's a lot more that can be done. If you simply put the right policy and procedures in place, you can operate in Iran, you can export to Iran. You just need to ask those questions of what can be done, rather than look at the surface, right? You've got a lot of companies still citing the BMP case as a reason not to go into Iran. A lot of companies citing, the other enforcement actions of hundreds of millions of dollars for reasons not to go into Iran. But as the U.S. government has said many times, these were unique cases of sophisticated, deliberate efforts to violate sanctions. They were not simply someone that took the time and care to put in place a compliance program, a policy, and then happened to slip up because someone slipped through the screening process, for example. And so I think if you actually scratch the surface and see that there are many companies operating in Iran, it can be done. If you're careful and diligent, I think the private sector would find that comfort that they're looking for.
Just as a follow-up, I mean, a lot of times higher-level policymakers will make certain public statements, but where the rubber hits the road with like the kind of lower down regulators, it's a different story. So there are a couple of recent quotes that I thought were relevant. Secretary Kerry said this in London in May, when he was trying to convince European banks to go back into Iran. He said, banks in Europe are allowed to open accounts for Iran. Banks in Europe are allowed to do business. Banks in Europe can fund programs, lend money. That's absolutely open for business as long as it's not a designated entity, period. Very simple. When you, in your interactions with OFAC or in the legal community's interactions with OFAC, do you find that reflected in their advice to you? And then can you talk a little bit about, I mean, his caveat at the end is important, as long as it's not a designated entity. That includes the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which plays a huge role in Iran's economy. So what is it like actually on the implementation of that sort of statement? And when a business actually does want to go into Iran, is it that simple? What do they have to look out for?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point that Secretary Kerry is making there is fundamentally true, in that if you actually look at what the sanctions require, if you actually look at what the sanctions prohibit, and where they draw the line, you can go into Iran and do business. It's obviously not so simple. If it was simple, I wouldn't have anything to do all day. But the reality is, it is, the word I would use is manageable, right? Look, avoiding SDNs in Iran is a challenge. The IRGC is very present. The Iranians are starting to be more transparent about where the IRGC has its interests. It's starting to be more transparent about which entities are owned and controlled by the IRGC. But if anything, that makes it, that doesn't make it easier. That just sort of clears the mist away to determine what's off limits. But that is going to be helpful in the long run. It's going to make due diligence easier. It's going to make screening easier for companies that are operating in Iran. And so, I think the crux of his point that it can be done is correct, so long as you're simply, putting the right procedures in place.
All right, so Barbara, I'd like to turn to you now.
Sure.
Can you touch a bit on the domestic scene in Iran? President Rouhani seems to genuinely want engagement with the West and the return of Western business. How do you see the power balance between him and the Revolutionary Guards and the Supreme Leader playing out in this first year of the nuclear deal?
First, thank you very much to Dick Morningstar and everyone for inviting me to participate. Of course, these are the huge questions that we all need answered, and it's impossible to predict with 100% certainty how things will go. I think what's clear, and I don't know if the intention behind the JCPOA was to get a nuclear deal, as Chris pointed out, but it has touched off a much deeper debate in Iran about what its role in the international community is going to be. The secondary sanctions have been lifted. Certain kinds of business and investment is now permitted. But Iran sees that it's not easy to roll back the isolation of the past, particularly 5-6 years when sanctions were hitting their peak. And so the Iranians now have to decide what do they have to do to convince the rest of the world that it is actually safe to do business in Iran again, and that, for example, the oil companies, we haven't talked about the oil companies, but they're being asked to sign contracts that will go on for decades for exploration. How safe is that in the context of a very volatile political environment in Iran? I've always been accused of being too optimistic about Iran, and I don't want to fall into that trap, but I do see some very positive signs. I think there's really hard fighting going on the part of Rouhani and his ministers to try to establish clear rules of the road that will be acceptable to foreign businesses. We've seen, for example, that Iran has entered into extensive negotiations with the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, which is a watchdog group that was set up to police money laundering and impose restrictions on terrorism financing. The Iranians have an action plan that they reached with the FATF. I believe they signed it in June. They're starting to implement it. The FATF suspended so-called countermeasures against Iran for a year to give Iran time. These are the sort of measures that basically tell foreign banks don't have anything to do with Iran. So Iran has gone from a true blacklist to a kind of blacklist light when it comes to the FATF, and this has enabled Iran to open bank accounts abroad. I am hearing that there is even a first-tier European bank or two that has gone back into Iran. Nobody is publicizing this yet because they're concerned about backlash from the US Congress, from shareholders, from various groups in this country that are fighting tooth and nail to prevent Iran from benefiting from the JCPOA. But it is slowly picking up. So, this is good news. The question is, can Iran actually now diminish the role of the IRGC in its economy? The role of these organizations that are run by IRGC people grew during sanctions, as one would expect. If Iran was cut out of legitimate business, the groups that have ways of laundering money and smuggling and whatnot, these are the groups that one would expect to benefit, and indeed they did. And now the IRGC is fighting to keep its share of the pie, especially as that pie appears to be growing now with with the relief of these sanctions. But there's some very interesting articles that have been in the Iranian press. I don't know if these are true or not. One of them was in Kayhan, which is a notoriously anti-government publication, but it claimed recently that the Iranian government, or that rather two major banks in Iran, had decided not to do business with the organization for the IRGC that does a lot of construction work, the Hatam al-Anbiya construction company. But I think it is fair to say, and you know, that Rouhani and company are working very, very hard on these issues. One of the main reasons is that Iran desperately needs international financing, particularly for its oil and gas industry. The oil minister, Zanganeh, says he wants $185 billion of foreign investment by 2020. He's also talked about the fact that in all these shared gas and oil fields, other countries are pumping out the resources, and Iran is not in a position to be able to do the same because it doesn't have the technology to really exploit these resources. So I think Rouhani and Zanganeh and others are making a very potent argument that, okay, Iran has an opportunity now to actually benefit from this deal and to get back to where it was and even grow from that point of view, but they're going to have to obey some international rules of the road, and there just is no other way around it. So I think we still have extraordinary leverage through the FATF, through the remaining US sanctions, to encourage Iran to get its house in order, particularly its financial house in order. And this will be an enormous benefit going down. Now, you mentioned the domestic situation, political situation. We're not the only ones with elections. Iran has presidential elections coming up next May, June. May. And Rouhani will run again. I think it's a reasonable expectation that he will win. So far, the more hardline elements have not been able to come up with a credible candidate to run against him. Ahmadinejad, the former president, has made noises about a political comeback, but he caused so much chaos when he was president before that it's even questionable whether he would be allowed to run by the Guardian Council, which is the organization that vets various candidates for political elected office in Iran. We have Ghalibaf, the mayor of Tehran, but he's now embroiled in a new scandal over housing and various kickbacks and so on. The others in the field have run before. They're all has-beens. They look really weak. Rouhani is a unique sort of individual. He is not a moderate. He's a pragmatist, and he's a survivor of the system. He's a pillar of the system who's been there from the very beginning. I mean, he was even involved in Iran-Contra. I was at an event recently where Bud McFarlane, a former US official, talked about his conversations with Rouhani during the Iran-Contra crisis, and about how even then Rouhani was talking about Iran getting back to a proper role in the international community, and that we just had to be patient, that all revolutions had to run their course. It was fascinating. So I have a lot of faith in his abilities. I look at the people he's put into government, particularly people like Javad Zarif, very, very capable Iranian foreign minister. You know, and I think these guys have arguments that they can use internally to say, look, do you want to stay a third-rate country forever? Do you want to get to where Iran should be? You know, Iran could have been like South Korea, could have been like Taiwan, could have been like Turkey before the recent problems there. You know, or do you, if you want to get to that status, then we have to play by certain rules of the road. So it's going to be a fascinating argument to watch. I expect more incidents. I expect more Iranian Revolutionary Guard boats menacing US naval ships in the Persian Gulf. Unfortunately, I expect Iranian Americans and other dual nationals, many of them, to remain in prison, which is horrific. And may I have a shout out to Siamak Namazi and his father Bakr Namazi, who remain in prison, which is ridiculous, and so many others. This is the way the IRGC fights back, as we know, to try to make Iran continue to look like a pariah state, and thereby strengthen their ability to remain in control of key elements of the system and of the economy. But I'll put my money on Rouhani in the long term.
The arguments that you mentioned that Rouhani and Zarif, will make in the run-up to the election, they've been making for a year, two, almost 3 years now. How would you say the Supreme Leader views those arguments, and what is, because at the end of the day, even if there's election, even if Rouhani wins, the Supreme Leader is still in charge and ultimately oversees the IRGC and their actions. They don't operate, in a rogue manner. How do you see his thinking either evolving or not evolving on these questions of Iran truly opening up to the West and to Western business?
Well, you know better than me, Yagane, that he has a balancing act that he has to perform. He needs the IRGC. He needs them for Iran's external military operations in places like Syria and Yemen and Iraq. So he has to make sure that they are taken care of one way or another. But I think he also understands the arguments that are being made. He has legacy issues to consider. He is not in the best of health, we keep hearing. He will not be there forever. And he understands that ordinary Iranians are still very, very frustrated and angry that they have not seen tangible benefits from the JCPOA. There's still a lot of unemployment. Inflation has come down, but still a lot of unemployment and discontent within the system. So he will play his balancing act. But I think the strong arguments really will be on the side of Rouhani and company. And may I also just say that the United States actually can do more to improve the environment. It can approve the Boeing deal. OFAC is sitting on the Boeing deal and the Airbus deal. If these planes go through, Iranians will be able to fly without having to worry that the plane is going to fall out of the sky. That would be a really potent goodwill gesture. The U.S. could allow multilateral lending to Iran for environmental purposes. We had an event here at the Council a couple of days ago on the environmental challenges that are facing Iran, which are extreme. Because Iran's on the so-called terrorist list, the Global Environment Facility, the World Bank, can't lend to Iran for the environment. If this were to somehow change, I think that would also be a potent signal to the Iranians that it's not about the Iranian people. We want them to succeed, and we're not looking to continue to punish them for actions that they have no control over.
Chris, can I ask you to respond to that? Are there more ways? Are there more ways that the U.S. could engage with ordinary Iranians? The points that Barbara mentioned, but also, are there more people-to-people exchanges that can take place? Is there just greater engagement that could happen, sort of at the popular level, that would advance U.S. interests?
Good question. First, I'm really glad Barbara's on the panel. I always really benefit from her political analysis on Iran, and it's really helpful. There are limits to what the U.S. government can do, but I think, Barbara makes the right point that there are opportunities for Iran to re-engage in their international community that go beyond the JCPOA. They could lie in other areas. As the U.S. government, though, we do have to be really careful about what we say and what we do with respect to the politics of other countries. And the last thing we want to do is be seen as pushing in one direction or another, or trying to accomplish one particular political outcome or another. I've always been of the view that you really have to let the Iranians or any other country manage their own politics. That's part of this debate that we see with comments by the Supreme Leader. They know their politics much better than we do. I say the same thing when the Iranians or Europeans will come to me and say, "Oh my gosh, what did your Congress say?" And I say, "Let us manage our own politics and worry about yours, and we'll let you know if there's a problem on the horizon." So to a certain degree, we do try to take a bit of a hands-off approach to trying to, empower or do things like that, because you can get yourself wrapped up into things that you may not intend. And outcomes may be exactly the opposite. I mean, there's a limit to what U.S. government support, how much benefit that could actually do to any particular cause in Iran. So we, as the government, have to take a different role. That doesn't mean that there aren't opportunities that will surface over time where we look at an opportunity and we see it in the U.S. interest to follow through. It doesn't mean that there won't be those sorts of things that come up. On the aircraft deals that Barbara mentions, I'm not at liberty to talk about specific companies, and I wouldn't want to speak for OFAC either. But what I can say is that as part of the JCPOA, we committed to allow for the export of commercial passenger aircraft to Iran, and we're going to follow through on that. That is, it is a little complicated because for those of you that don't know, aircraft themselves have a lot of very highly technical and highly controlled
Potentially
internationally controlled dual-use components and parts. And so this isn't the only place where we sell aircraft. There are a variety of sort of very careful reviews about what exactly the plane, who's it going to, where's it going to be. And so when you haven't had this sort of engagement in over 30 years, it's not surprising to see that it takes a little while to go through all that process. Again, not speaking to any particular company in this particular instance, but as a general matter. So I think Barbara's right about everything. I think there are limits though where the U.S. government can play.
Can I ask you, this is beyond the JCPOA, but we did have the prisoner exchange on the day of implementation. Since then, right before and then since then, there have been more arrests. Siam Namazi, who's known to many people in this room, his father, and then a third U.S. citizen, as well as a number of European and Canadian dual nationals. This, in addition to the effect that it has on them and their families, also affects the business climate, especially Siamak's arrest, because he was not at the time of his arrest, but had a history of being very involved with Iranian and Western business interests. And it would seem to depress Iranian dual nationals' interest in going to work in Iran. Can you speak a little bit about kind of how the U.S. government views these arrests? What efforts, if any, you can talk about to get them released?
I'm happy to. This is a complicated area. In particular, there are a variety of privacy concerns with respect to individuals that the U.S. government has restricted what I can say about any individual case. So let me, in the same way that I just did on the airline issue, speak a little bit more generally, which is the fact that we continue to call on Iran to respect the rights of its citizens, and certainly to respect the rights of American citizens that are in Iran. And we continue to call on them to not to harass and to release any U.S. nationals that have been wrongly detained. That is something that is a core part of our policy toward Iran. It is something that was one of our top priorities as we were leading up to implementation day, was to secure the release of those citizens that were wrongfully detained at that time. I would love to tell you that will never happen again, but it will. And there are going to be in any country, there are constantly these sorts of things that you have to manage. They're particularly acute in Iran, and it's one where we continue to press the Iranians for their to release those Americans and let them come back home. I can't speak to really any of the specific cases here in the public setting.
Understand, sure. And I will of course make time for your questions, so get them ready. David, I just had a follow-up for you on a slightly lighter topic, which is the U.S. election. How do private businesses, international businesses, see the two candidates' positions and public statements towards Iran? The foreign policy advisor to Hillary Clinton, Jake Sullivan, has said that one thing that could be done under a Clinton administration is to increase the costs to Iran of engaging in its confrontational actions, particularly the ballistic missile tests and other actions. How do people see the prospect of either Clinton or Trump administration when it comes to implementation of the JCPOA?
Sure, absolutely. I think the election is providing uncertainty, and uncertainty makes private companies wary of embarking on any new opportunity that requires effort and cost and time upfront. And so I think certainly there are a lot of companies in the private sector taking a wait-and-see approach. It's a little difficult to speculate where the new administrations would come out on the deal, or given the well, I should say this. The Clinton campaign has obviously been very clear on where the administration would come out on the deal, that it supports the deal, it wants to see it succeed. My personal view is that the Clinton administration is going to need to put in just as much capital and effort and commitment as this administration in order to, from the private sector perspective, see the deal continue to give comfort to companies of what they can do and where the red lines are. So I think wanting to support the deal is one thing, showing the same level of commitment that this administration has to make it work is another. And so I think even with a Clinton administration, there is a question mark whether that is going to be the case. And the reality is that's something that's going to have to be seen when the administration gets into office and has a million different priorities facing them, and where they put their time and effort. For a Trump administration, again, let's just say uncertainty makes companies wary, and maybe I'll leave it there.
Sure. Although he has said, I thought I saw an interview with him, I think in the New York Times, where he expressed surprise that U.S. companies were not allowed
So
to do business.
this is that is correct. So he has said it's a terrible deal, and we shouldn't have given Iran the money. It's unclear whether, he said we shouldn't have given them the money wherever, he said it's our money, their money. But at the same time, he says it's completely unfair that U.S. companies can't go into Iran. He's also said that the FCPA is a terrible law.
This is the Foreign Corrupt Practices
Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which frankly is another challenge for U.S. companies going into Iran.
It bars U.S. companies and even some international companies that have any
that
nexus
are listed.
to the
That's
US,
right. That's right.
From bribing foreign officials.
That's right. So absolutely. So the FCPA has been around since 1977, and as you said, is essentially an anti-foreign bribery statute that the U.S. and U.S. listed companies are prohibited from engaging in bribery for a business advantage overseas. Obviously there is a level of corruption in Iran that means you've got to be very careful about your FCPA compliance. This is just another issue of compliance when entering the market. Donald Trump has said it's a terrible law. So would he do away with that? Would he allow U.S. companies to go into Iran? That would obviously be going in a completely different direction. So. I find it hard to predict exactly
Trump
what
Hotel in Tehran. I can see
exactly,
it now.
exactly. So I think it's and then of course, one would have to assume if we have a President Trump, there's a good chance we have a Republican House and Senate. How would they feel about those changes?
Right.
I think they'd probably feel differently. Again, it's very difficult to predict, and frankly, that uncertainty is what is making companies hesitate just a little. And I think if Clinton wins in November, I think we'll see a sort of surge of comfort and a second look at Iran, at the companies that aren't already looking. I think if Trump wins, there'll be a sort of long period of holding our breath to see what exactly is going to happen.
Sure. Can I ask you, and potentially Chris as well, to maybe answer a deeper question about U.S. sanctions implementation and the rolling back of it? We've had OFAC officials say, and there's no reason to not believe them, that they are working flat out in terms of trying to give guidance, issue licenses, answer questions, traveling all over the world to meet with executives and banks and everyone they can to clearly explain what's going on. They're working with a staff of less than 200 people across all these divisions, including the actual people who decide who to sanction. Their budget has not really kept up with the pace of new executive orders, new legislation, legislating sanctions, all the additional work that they have to do. Do you think there's potential, and is there a need for the next administration to consider requesting more funding for OFAC or for other sanctions implementation agencies or bodies that have to do? I think the State Department's sanctions body has increased a bit, if I'm not mistaken. But what are your thoughts on that? You're both familiar with the interagency process.
Yeah. Absolutely. This is a huge issue, right? OFAC is a very small office bureau. within the US government that has an inordinate amount of work, both internally in order to impose sanctions, in order to implement them, and then also externally in not only bringing enforcement actions, but helping the vast majority of companies that simply want to be in compliance to know where the lines are. And it's an incredible amount of work for 200 people. And frankly, I think one of the greatest fixes should be to increase the resources and bodies for OFAC, particularly on the compliance side, the licensing side. You have 200 people, and if they're spending most of their day responding to inquiries from Congress, that does not leave a lot of time to actually implement the sanctions themselves. I think there's a broader issue, though, that has made this sort of level of resources unsustainable, is the fact that sanctions have changed dramatically over the last 10 years, right? I mean, you have had, not only have you just had increase in volume, I mean, this president has issued more executive orders on sanctions than all his predecessors combined. I think by the time I left the White House in December, I think it was 33. There's obviously an increase in volume, but there's also a change in the way that the U.S. government implements sanctions,
Much
right?
more complex.
Exactly. 10 years ago, it was, the sort of the real revolution that Stuart Levy headed was to create, just make individuals, entities, countries toxic, and to get banks out, to get banks to stay away, create these very large gray areas where simply, if you had to ask the question, then the answer was no. If even you thought it might be a problem with OFAC, you should stay away.
And arguably that overhang is maybe what's preventing some of the business and going back to Iran, because until a year and a half ago, the answer was just no, basically.
That's absolutely right. And I think, this started it even started a couple of years ago, right? It started with Burma, with the way we lifted sanctions in a way that was fairly complex, right? We wanted companies to go in, but we wanted them to avoid SDNs. We wanted them to file public reports if they were making investments above a certain threshold. And then with Russia, certainly the revolution was complete, right? To sanctions, 3.0 or whatever you want to call it, of, drawing these very intricate lines where the way we expected the sanctions to operate, because that's the way we wanted them to work, was that companies would go right up to the line, but not cross it. Mm-hmm. And then obviously with the JCPOA, it's just a really new level of intricacy of really drawing that line in a way that pushes US policy interests. And, frankly, the bottom line is it's better, right? I mean, the ability to use sanctions in a way that more precisely pushes US policy in the direction the government wants it to go is great, right? The fact that this tool is now much more useful, much more subtle, that is a huge benefit to US foreign policy. But the level of implementation has to match that. And OFAC, honestly, some of the absolute most dedicated, intelligent, committed, people in the US government, but there's only so many of them, and there's only so many hours of the day, and there are, a lot of questions. And so I think as we move in this direction of sanctions, where it becomes much more complex, much more subtle, those resources are going to have to keep up.
Sure. Chris, you were at NSC, you're now at State. Do you feel this sort of squeeze of resources when it comes to sanctions implementation?
Well, I think suffice it to say there's always a squeeze of resources in the U.S. government. I think a lot of our policy areas could use more. I won't speak to OFAC's situation. We've tried to put as much as we can behind implementation of the JCPOA. We do have a new office dedicated to that, Office of Iran Nuclear Implementation, led by Ambassador Steve Mull. And we've got a pretty robust group in our Bureau of Economic Affairs working on sanctions relief issues as well. But to be clear, the burden on us is much lower than it is on OFAC, and I'll just repeat what David said, which is that there are a lot of incredibly committed individuals over there working as hard as they can, working really long hours to try to make all of this work, but there is certainly a very intense volume of issues for them to deal with.
Sure. Barbara, did you have any comments on that, or I can also turn to questions?
I think we can go to the questions,
Great.
yeah.
All right, so Ambassador Morningstar, and get your questions ready.
I think the presentations have really been extraordinary, and thank you for that. As I listen, and given that I'm old and have spent my life being in business, being a lawyer, being a policymaker, I think that there is a disconnect maybe between policymakers and even lawyers and companies. And when listening to the presentations, I was saying to myself, you know, this is sort of like a pharmaceutical ad on television. You know, there are great benefits by investing in Iran, but you can die 100 ways, you know, if you do it. And I don't think it's enough to say, well, the risks are manageable, at least not enough for a company. I mean, putting my company hat back on, I would say, you know, yeah, I understand it can't be risk-free, but I at least want to feel confident that if I make the investment and that, you know, it's a good project, that, you know, we'll see the benefits of the project. So I guess the question I would ask, and you've already answered it to some extent, I think to the best you can, how do you instill that confidence? And maybe I see there are companies here. What would it take for a company to get beyond the manageable point, but to the point, well, gee, you know, we feel really confident that maybe we can do something?
David, you seem best suited.
Sure. I mean, I think, you know, look, manageable is the starting point, but obviously the approach it varies wildly based on the type of business, right? Are you obviously providing, you know, exporting goods to Iran is the most simple enterprise here in terms of screening your customers. What are the items? Where are they coming from? You know, do they comply with sanctions? Do they comply with export controls? You can answer those questions fairly simply. You know, you obviously get more complex when you're talking about financial services and the relationships that have to be established in order to be able to do that. When you're getting to the point where you're talking about investment, who's involved, who's on the other side, what happens if the investment goes through and you're actually operating in Iran, how do you screen the third parties that you're working with? Every company's situation is different. And I mean, I say manageable, but note I did not adopt Secretary Kerry's word that it's simple, right? So, you know, some of these projects take, you know, a couple of weeks to figure out and put policies and procedures in place. Some of these take months and months. Some of them, you know, we're looking at sort of years down the road for these things to actually come to fruition. But, you know, I mean, honestly, I think if companies scratch below the surface a little, right, if you get away from simply citing the big enforcement actions and look at why those were imposed, and if you get away from that and actually look at what you as a company need to do, given your business, given the entities and individuals that you will be coming into contact with Iran, you know, that's what's going to make companies comfortable. I think a lot of executives in boardrooms hear Iran, and that's the end of the conversation because they're thinking about these bigger picture issues. But if you actually look at once companies look at what they need to do, the procedures that they need to put in place for their business, life becomes much more practical, and you know, you're really talking about the same types of activities and same types of risks that you're confronting in many other types of the world as well.
Barbara?
Yeah, I mean, Iran has a huge, well-educated market, 80 million people. There aren't very many untouched markets like this in the world, so I think that's tremendously attractive for a lot of companies. There are sectors, pharmaceuticals, agricultural products that have been going to Iran throughout this period. There were some hitches here and there, but they've all worked out financing arrangements, and they seem satisfied with those. So, I mean, we are looking at the more difficult and controversial areas like foreign direct investment. But again, if Iran wants this investment, it knows what it has to do to wall off the IRGC, to set up the appropriate compliance procedures. And they have really learned this now, I think, over the last year in a way that wasn't clear to a lot of people in the Iranian government and in Iranian business sectors before. So that in itself, I think, is a real benefit.
Chris, you were going to say something.
I was going to say that exact thing.
There you go. I should be in the U.S. government, but no. It's one other thing, if I may, too, and that is I was at a conference in Zurich a few months back, and I met all these amazing Iranian women entrepreneurs. And I always say, if you want to make sure that you're not dealing with the IRGC, just do a deal with an Iranian woman entrepreneur. They have high-tech companies. They import commercial goods. They are amazing, so educated, so talented, and you can avoid a lot of problems. So.
All right. So
pitch.
other questions. So yes, Ms. Sadili, and then maybe we'll take a few at once.
I'm Shala Sadeghi from Voice of America, Persian TV. My question is to Mr. Beckmeyer regarding the sanctions. Although the State Department and the White House says they have mechanism of the sanctions at their disposal, if Iran violates the JCPOA, they can enforce those. But the present Sanction Act in the Congress, which is due to run out at the end of this year, it only kicks in if the Iran violates the JCPOA. So why is the White House reluctant to give a go-ahead to its party colleagues, Democrats in the Congress, to renew these sanctions? And if I may ask a question from Barbara, aren't you a bit too optimistic about the IRGC grip on the power? Why do you think that they listen to old Ayatollah Khamenei?
Actually, yeah, let's just take those two. So, Chris, you want to go first?
Sure. We are, there are a variety of bills out there with respect to Iran-related legislation. We look at all of them very closely, and we monitor the situation. In the spirit of kind of the comment I made earlier about the politics of everything, every bill that you see does not necessarily reflect what is going to be a final piece of legislation, and so I'll reserve our comments on any specific bill until we have, pieces of legislation for the administration to consider. What we've said, though, is that, and what the president has said, is that he'll veto any legislation that would prevent us from implementing the JCPOA. So that means bills that would, make it difficult or make it impossible or require us to reimpose the sanctions that were in the JCPOA for reasons that may be outside of the scope of the JCPOA. We've been clear about that, and he's said that a number of times. On the Iran Sanctions Act, there is, I think, sometimes some misunderstanding about the degree of importance it plays in the broader thing. There are multiple pieces of legislation that were waived as part of the JCPOA. That's significant portions of that act were waived as part of that. And so I know there's been some discussion about whether or not to renew, and I think when we see an actual bill, we'll consider our position on that.
Mm-hmm. Barbara, did you want to?
Yeah, I'm not. Wouldn't say I'm optimistic about controlling the IRGC, except in the sense that I think Rouhani has a very coherent argument to make to wall off their activities from the rest of the economy, and certainly important parts of the economy where Iran needs foreign investment. And that's the argument that he's making with the Supreme Leader. Now, I think the Supreme Leader can tell the IRGC what to do. I don't think the IRGC tells the Supreme Leader what to do. At least that's not been my impression so far. So this is an argument they're going to have to sort out. It's a major debate in Iran. How successful a country do they want to be? How do they define success? Is success just the regime hanging on with an impoverished people, or is it a growing economy, a flourishing economy that's more interconnected with the rest of the world? So, you know, I would like to hope that the latter will be the case, but obviously there are no guarantees.
I will note, I mean, there are no experts on Iran, only students of Iran.
Absolutely.
But it seems like in their history, and going back to even what Khomeini said before the revolution, economic development has not really been their focus. It's more been kind of the ideological underpinnings of the government. I don't know if you want to.
It has been, but Iran has gone through enormous changes over the last 37 years. Every time I go there, I'm amazed by the quality of the people, the level of education, the level of sophistication, and any government has to be somehow sensitive to the nature of the society, cannot completely ignore the wishes and desires of its people, however authoritarian that regime may be. So I continue to think, especially as I look at the next generation of people coming in, that you know, there will be these changes over time. It may not be as fast as a lot of Iranians would like. It may not be as fast as we would like, but I think it's inevitable.
If I may just ask that Secretary Clinton supported the Renewal Sanction Act. So if she comes into power.
You want to repeat the question?
If I may ask, add that Secretary Clinton supported the Renewal the Sanction Act last April. So if she comes to White House, do you oppose that?
It'd be a different administration.
If either president is elected, I'm a career State Department official, and whoever gets elected, I will do exactly what they tell me to do.
Good answer. All right. Yes, sir. Right here.
Doug Hengel, former State Department official who, in a previous life, worked very closely with these two gentlemen on Iran sanctions. So, pleasure to see you both here.
That's a very kind way of putting it, by the way. Both of us work for Doug, would you point out. So.
David, a question, I guess, for you. In addition to the remaining U.S. sanctions on Iran, there's also many U.S. states have sanctions of one kind or another on Iran. How much of a challenge is this to a company looking to do business there?
So I can tell you that in terms of examining the risks, it's something we've certainly worked with companies to look at. I have some very large binders of state measures. There are 37 states, by my count, with their own measures for imposing sanctions on companies doing certain activities in Iran. However, in terms of a risk, I would say it's not something that has stood in the way of any company that I've talked to beyond the federal sanctions and anti-corruption, anti-money laundering compliance that any company should have in place anyway. You know, there are some fairly broad authorities granted to state officials to impose sanctions on companies, especially doing business in Iran's energy sector. But if you look at how states have actually deployed those sanctions, they've tended to be against companies who were engaged in activities that arguably triggered federal measures anyway. Even if the lists have not matched up exactly between companies sanctioned by the U.S. government and companies sanctioned by the states. You know, I think my personal view is that there's a real risk there's a real risk from states if they do intend to derail the deal. But you know, I think that's something I'm assuming Chris and other U.S. government colleagues have worked with states very closely to ensure that the measures are as close as possible. So, to give you a much shorter answer, I would say it is something companies need to be aware of and look at. particularly if they're publicly listed companies with investment, pension funds and state employee funds invested in them. But I have not seen them become the one obstacle to activity in Iran that they could be.
I did a story on the state sanctions. Right, so we'll go right back to you.
Yeah.
I did a story on the state sanctions last year, and there was a company that sells medical equipment to Iran under the humanitarian license, and they didn't know until I told them that they had been boycotted by the Michigan State Pension Fund. So I don't know if that's just an anecdote, but it may show the real impact on their bottom line. Maybe it's not that much.
Yeah.
Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good point. It is worth noting that we use this term impose sanctions pretty generally, and when you get sanctions imposed by the federal government, that can mean that you cannot have any contact with a U.S. person in financial sense. When we're talking about these sanctions at the state level, in most cases, what it means is that the state pension fund will just not be allowed to invest in you. It doesn't mean that you won't be able to live in Idaho, or you won't be able to open a bank account in Idaho, or engage with companies in Texas or whatever. I mean, so there's a really big difference in what these states have tried to do. This is in general divestment legislation, or legislation that doesn't allow for the procurement of goods from that particular company. So maybe the elementary school can't buy products from this company, but I think it speaks to the degree to which it is a bottom line question. The penalties are far below what we often talk about when we say imposing sanctions.
Yeah, Chris makes a really great point, and in fact, in many cases, it's even more attenuated than that, right? I mean, the actual sanction may be that state funds cannot invest directly into a, quote, sanctioned company, but nonetheless, they can still invest into a mutual fund that is invested in that company, which is frankly mostly what they do anyway. So, I think there's reputational risk that you'll get added to some list somewhere on some state website, although that's been happening less recently since the deal. But in terms of impact on bottom line, it's the risk is low. Let's put it that way.
All right. Yes, sir. Here, in front or in the middle.
Hello, my name is Ed Martin from Eastern Mennonite University. My question isn't so much about commerce, but it's certainly about relations between Iran and the U.S. And I'd ask Chris, for the last about 20 years, I've been traveling to Iran and been involved in several education exchange programs. And when I go, my visa has to be approved by the foreign ministry in Tehran, but it can be issued by the interest section here in Washington. The Iranians that I've helped to bring to the U.S. have to go out of Iran to Dubai or Ankara or Yerevan to apply for their visa and then go back there to actually get it. Is there any thinking about having some sort of interest section in Tehran that can actually issue the visas that would be approved by the State Department?
That's a great question. We get a lot of questions about. Actually, it's interesting. We have a website which we call which fields a lot of questions like this on our Iran policy at the State Department. And the top question we get is always about visas to the United States. That's what people are by far the most interested in. And you're right that we do not have a U.S. presence of any kind in Iran. The government of Switzerland serves as our protecting power, and in cases where there are detentions of American citizens, they seek to get consular access for those purposes. But there is not a function for supplying visas, which does require Iranians to leave the country. That's not something that we're considering changing for now. The JCPOA is like I said, it was a big step on the nuclear front, but it didn't resolve a lot of our other concerns. And really, to get to that point, you'd need to. There are a lot of things that you would need to resolve, both on a policy, but just also logistical level, to kind of get to that level. It's not to say that no government would ever consider it, but I don't know that it's something you should expect in the next few months.
Chris, could I just follow up on his question? Is it because the Iranians have told us they don't want us to even ask for it?
No, I'm sorry. That implies that this is an ongoing conversation about this particular issue. The way I think I would best describe it is that we have a lot of issues with Iran that we're focused on dealing with, that include dealing or trying to, including countering their activities with respect to support for Assad in Syria, their support to the Houthis in Yemen, support for terrorism. There are a lot of issues that are on the docket, and I think that there will need to be. So that suggests that there are a lot of issues we need to deal with before we get to that point. Doesn't mean that you have to solve every problem before you get there. I just wouldn't want to speak to a particular time frame or any sort of agenda on that front.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions? Yes, sir, here.
Hi, my name is Jack Korpansky, unaffiliated. My question is about Russia. Does Iran provide kind of a backdoor for Russia to avoid sanctions, direct sanctions, where U.S. companies could deal with Iranian companies who deal with other Iranian companies that then deal with the Russians?
Well, I mean, just as I'm not so familiar with the Russia sanctions. My colleague here is, but what I can say is that, for the most part, U.S. companies are still prohibited from dealing with Iran because of the sanctions that remain in place. The sanctions we lived in the JCPOA were those that applied largely to non-U.S. firms. So, to the core of your question, whether a U.S. company could use that as a channel, I don't suspect so, but David might have a better
Yeah,
sense.
I mean, if I were advising a company on how to evade sanctions, which I would not, for the record, that would be the very last way I would suggest they do it, because of the sanctions on Iran, for a U.S. person at least, are more comprehensive than what we have in place on Russia. So in terms of a backdoor, it would be a very, very inefficient and ineffective way to evade sanctions on Russia.
Oh, but a backdoor for Russia to evade.
Well, a backdoor from Russia to evade. I mean, I don't think it's so much about evading sanctions, right? I mean, the United States, Europe, Canada, Australia, Japan. There's a large international coalition with sanctions on Russia for its activity in Ukraine, but not the entire world, right? And so obviously there are business opportunities elsewhere in the world and countries they do business that have not imposed sanctions, including Iran. So inevitably there are going to be Russians looking for activities, business opportunities in Iran. But as we said earlier, we talked earlier about the sort of intricacy and the more nuance of the Russia and Iran sanctions compared to old regimes. The Russia sanctions are built on not just designating individuals and entities, but access to financing. Major Russian financial institutions are not looking for financing and oil and gas field services in Iran. They're looking to Europe, they're looking to the United States, and that's why the Russia sanctions were designed that way.
Other questions, particularly from women? Yes, please, here.
Hi, it's Emily Meredith from Energy Intelligence. And Chris, you said that there's a lot of misunderstanding about the Iran Sanctions Act and its criticality for the JCPOA. Could you speak to what tools then are more critical? Can you help us, understand a little bit better?
Sure. And I hope I didn't mean to suggest that I feel like any one piece of legislation is more important than the other. My comment was really intended to say that there are some that believe that the Iran Sanctions Act contains all of the sanctions that have ever been on Iran, and that those are the ones left in the JCPOA. It's a subset. There are 3, 4, 5 different pieces of legislation and just as many executive orders that have created kind of a framework of sanctions on Iran, and there's a certain amount of overlap between all of those. So my point in saying that was kind of correcting that misunderstanding that this is the big piece. What we've said, we've been questioned about the role of that particular bill. We have very strong sanctions authorities across the board if we were wanting to reimpose sanctions for any reason, and so and that's intentional. Part of the way we crafted this entire deal is to make sure that we had that ability. So, not to speak to any of the specifics in that particular act, I just didn't want to prioritize it over others which have equally broad measures in it.
Did you have a follow-up? Or?
Are you saying that if that goes away, then sort of the infrastructure is still
There's
there?
CISADA as well, right?
Right.
So Many of our sanctions that have been imposed on Iran and any other country have been imposed via executive order under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And so to be honest, almost any piece of legislation that makes up sanctions could, in theory, be replicated through an executive order if you needed to. That's the overarching point we've been making, is that there are those authorities that exist.
All right, and we have time for maybe one last question. Anyone has one? Yes, sure. Go ahead. Just wait for the microphone. This one here.
May I talk about different topic with regards to recent North Korea atomic tests again? How much does it worry the State Department and White House about involvement of Iran with North Korea, which goes back, they have had some cooperation with regards to China recent glitch in relationship?
Good question. I mean, I'm not a North Korea expert, but obviously we condemn what has occurred there and continue to have a lot of concern about the situation in North Korea. With respect to the connection, with how that influences our Iran policy, all I can say is that the JCPOA was constructed to prevent Iran from being able to get enough fissile material to construct a nuclear weapon. And you contrast that to the North Korea situation, that's exactly what we're trying to prevent from happening. Iran does not have currently enough nuclear material for a weapon in the way that North Korea does. And the whole point of this process was to make sure that we eliminated the means by which they could get that enriched uranium. And we did that through the JCPOA by removing 98% of its stockpile of enriched uranium, by removing 2/3 of the centrifuges that had to enrich that uranium further to a weapon grade, by implementing transparency measures that are really at the top end of what's ever been implemented in a non-proliferation regime. And as a result, we lengthened what was this breakout time, which is the amount of time not to get a weapon, but just to get enough material for a weapon, from 90 days to over a year. And so we are confident that through those range of restrictions that we got in the JCPOA, we prevented Iran from having the ability to develop a nuclear weapon, which is exactly what you don't want to have in the context of Iran or frankly many countries. And so that's been our approach from the get-go. Now, as far as there are always allegations that there might be transfers and things like that. We've got a variety of means at our disposal that these are risks that existed before and after the JCPOA, and we've got a variety of both diplomatic, operational, and intelligence means that we use to disrupt shipments of illicit cargoes and sensitive technologies that make it even more difficult for Iran to get any sort of control technologies through other means. And so we feel very comfortable that we have significantly reduced the risk that Iran would get and eliminate the possibility of Iran obtaining a nuclear weapon in the future.
That seems like a great place to end it. I want to thank all of you for joining us. Thank you for your excellent questions. I want to thank our panelists, and I especially want to thank Chris Backemeyer. It's always really valuable to have the government perspective, so thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you guys very much, and my esteemed panel.
Thank you all for coming. See you next time. Say such nice things about me. It won't help me.
They probably will.